that contribution from our colleague in the Maori Party who understands very clearly what matters in this country, and I think this budget delivers on what matters in this country, and that is about putting the right incentives into the New Zealand economy and looking after all the people who live in New Zealand. This budget, Mr Speaker, is about across-the-board tax cuts delivered to people in New Zealand, and I'm just going to go through those tax cuts and those tax rates because I think it's worth repeating them. So for people who have an income of under $14,000 who were paying 12.5% in tax, they get a tax cut down to 10.5%. Mr Speaker, that is significant. For those on an income between $14,000 and $48,000, their tax rate goes from 21% down to 17.5%. Mr Speaker, that is significant for those members of our country. For those people on an income up to $70,000, their tax rate goes from 33% down to 30%. That is a change that has been welcomed across the board. And for those people on an income over $70,000, their tax rate has gone down to 33%. Mr Speaker, this budget is providing across-the-board tax cuts. And it's interesting, isn't it, the opposition are all at sea with this budget. They're putting up hardly much of a fight. Don't seem to have latched on to anything they really dislike about this budget. In fact, it was very interesting to hear the contribution of Trevor Mallard, who largely agreed with a number of the provisions that have been brought about in this taxation measures bill. Mr Speaker, there is a rise in GST up to 15% from 12.5%, and to balance that, there will be an immediate rise of 2.2%, and that will be a rise on superannuation and working for families and benefits. Mr Speaker, there is a number of spending boosts contained in this budget. In health, there is $2.1 billion more over 4 years. That will go into frontline health services, good quality health spending. In education, $1.4 billion more over 4 years for better schooling and also early childhood education. In research, science and technology, $321 million over 4 years for new initiatives. That is all about growth in the New Zealand economy. And of course, faster broadband, $248 million extra over 4 years. But Mr Speaker, I want to talk about a budget initiative which hasn't been mentioned so far. And it is a tiny initiative, Mr Speaker, and it just goes to show that is an example of how a very small budget amount, carefully placed, can have a big impact on growing the New Zealand economy. The first one I want to talk about is the $30 million, which is going to be used to promote New Zealand as a tourism destination overseas. A relatively small budget amount, but in my view, that is significant for tourism in New Zealand because we are an exciting tourism destination, and with the Rugby World Cup proposed to be here next year, I believe it is important that we promote ourselves overseas. And the other example that I want to raise is comparatively minuscule at $5 million, but I am excited that the Department of Conservation is going to put $5 million to develop more cycle trails and camping grounds, and that is over the next year. And why do I think that is significant? Because $5 million is relatively small in the scheme of things, but I can tell you that in my own electorate, the Otago Rail Cycle Trail has had a huge impact on the economic well-being of the Otago region. And I'm just going to focus down on one very small provider of tourism services, and that is the Chatto Creek Tavern. Now, the Chatto Creek Tavern, which is just out of Alexandra at Chatto Creek, before the rail trail came into being, was struggling. It was one of those small businesses in one of those very tiny little towns which was facing closure and struggling. These days, 5-6 years later, the Chatto Creek Tavern is not only surviving, but it is thriving. There are now 13 people working in the Chatto Creek Tavern. They now do 180 lunches in the high season, 100 lunches in the low season. Now, the members opposite do not see the significance of this, and I do not blame them because they do not represent the provinces, but you extrapolate that benefit out from Middlemarch down to Clyde, all along the length of the Otago Central Rail Trail, and you can quickly see the benefit that an initiative like the rail trail brings to the local region. Yeah, right. Mr. Speaker, it is a very small budget amount, $5 million, but it is significant. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, this budget is about putting the right incentives into the economy. Interesting how well it's been received. That's right. And I will just leave you with this one statistic. Even by the close-up poll, which returned a result of 80% of people were in favour of the budget. Now, that is prime-time television. That is good news. Mr. Speaker, I commend this taxation bill to the House.